The wind howled across the barren expanse, carrying with it whispers of ancient stories, fragments of fear that clung to the air like a haunting melody. It wasn't just the sound of the desert wind, it was something deeper, an echo from the sands that refused to rest. Travelers spoke of strange vibrations beneath their feet, an unnerving hum that quickened the heartbeat and turned the stomach with a sense of dread. No one dared linger long in the last desert, for the stories of the warworms had a way of growing claws in the mind, scratching at reason and feeding an ancient fear that slumbered in every soul. In the legends of desert dwellers, the warworms were more than creatures, they were curses born of arrogance and punishment, the wrath of the earth incarnate. Some said they were once men, kings and warriors who defied the gods or sought forbidden power. They had bartered their humanity for dominion over the sands, only to be betrayed by their greed. Their bodies twisted into monstrous forms, scales like burnished bronze, eyes that gleamed with unholy light, and mouths that spewed venom and flame. Others believed they were spirits of the desert itself, guardians or destroyers, depending on who told the tale. In the cracked scrolls of ancient lore, the warworms were known by different names. In one culture, they were the Shoka, the silent movers who swallowed armies whole. Elsewhere, they were the Rithikin, the sand serpents that emerged only under the pale watch of the moon. Every tale had its variation, but all agreed on one thing: encountering a warworm was to invite death, not in a moment of fury, but in a slow, suffocating descent into despair. The last desert itself was a place shrouded in enigma. It was not marked on maps, for those who claimed to have found it never returned to chart its borders. Some whispered it was a cursed place, a shifting ocean of dooms that swallowed entire cities. Others believed it lay at the edge of the known world, where reality began to blur and time became a fleeting shadow. The air there was said to taste of ash, the sky always veiled in a hazy, unnatural red. It was a place where the sun seemed too close, burning away reason, and the nights were so cold they could freeze a man's soul. Theories swirled like sandstorms around the origins of the warworms. Some argued they were merely a product of imagination, a way for ancient people to explain the terrifying desolation of the last desert. But there were whispers, always whispers, of tracks too large and too deep to belong to any known creature. Hunters spoke of hollow dunes, their interiors carved into tunnels by something massive and alive. And then there were the skeletons, charred and scattered, discovered by those foolish enough to tread too far into the desert's embrace. For others, the warworms were something more than myth, their origins entwined with humanity's oldest fears. In one tale, they were the first creatures to rise from the earth when the gods shaped the world, primordial and fierce, guardians of secrets buried too deep for mortals to uncover. Another story painted them as the last remnants of a forgotten age, a time when creatures of impossible size roamed freely before being cursed to the sands by a jealous god. It is said that if you listen closely in the last desert, you can hear the sound of their movements beneath the earth, a low, rhythmic pulse that matches the beating of your own heart. Those who venture too far often speak of an overwhelming presence, a sense that the sands themselves are alive, watching, waiting. And always, there is the silence that follows, a silence so complete it drowns the soul, leaving nothing but terror in its wake. The fear of the warworms was not merely born of stories, but of the visceral, unshakable belief that the last desert was no place for the living. The sun, the sand, and the endless emptiness were nothing compared to the feeling of being hunted by something you could not see. Survivors spoke of the ground trembling beneath their feet, of shadows that slithered just out of sight. Some claimed they felt the creatures before they saw them, a suffocating pressure that wrapped around their chest like an invisible coil, leaving them gasping for air. There was a cruelty in the warworm myths, a reminder that humanity's hubris would always be punished. The last desert was a place where the line between man and beast blurred, where the natural world reclaimed its dominion, and where legends were carved into the bones of the unwary. The warworms did not just haunt the sands, they haunted the mind, their presence a lingering shadow that refused to be banished. And yet, for all the terror they inspired, there was a strange allure to the warworms, a pull that defied logic. Perhaps it was the desire to understand what lay beyond the limits of reason, to see what others had only whispered about in fear. Or perhaps it was something darker, an acknowledgement of the primal instincts buried within every human heart. In the last desert, those instincts came alive, and the warworms became not just creatures of legend, but reflections of the monsters we feared within ourselves. The last desert was not a place one stumbled upon lightly, nor was it a place anyone left unchanged. Those who ventured there brought back stories of the sand's strange hum, of shapes that moved too quickly for the eye to follow, and of an overwhelming sense of being watched. It was said that the warworms left no footprints, no tracks in the shifting dunes, as if the desert itself conspired to keep their existence hidden. But there were marks, scars in the land, ancient carvings in stone, and whispers in the wind that refused to be silenced. And still, the sands of the last desert shifted, hiding and revealing secrets with every gust of wind. Some claimed the warworms were long gone, their monstrous forms swallowed by the desert's relentless hunger. Others believed they were simply waiting, their vast bodies coiled beneath the surface, dreaming of the moment they would rise again. Whatever the truth, the last desert held onto its mysteries, its whispers, and its shadows, pulling all who dared to listen into its endless, haunting silence. The sky above the last desert burned with a fierce, unrelenting brilliance, the kind of light that seemed to strip the world bare. The air shimmered, alive with heat, twisting the horizon into cruel mirages. Beneath that unforgiving sky stretched an endless expanse of golden dunes, rising and falling like frozen waves in a sea that refused to end. It was said that no one crossed the last desert without leaving something behind, a piece of their soul, a fragment of their sanity. The land took what it wanted, leaving only whispers and shadows in its wake. The sand was unlike anything else in the world. It wasn't just grains beneath your feet, it was ancient, alive in ways that defied understanding. Some said the sands could sing, their voices a faint hum carried on the wind. Others claimed they moved on their own, shifting in patterns too precise to be natural. Travelers swore the desert had a memory, that it remembered every step you took and followed you with a silent, watching presence. It wasn't just a place, it was a predator, patient and unyielding. The last desert was as old as time itself, or so the stories went. Some claimed it was born of a great curse, a punishment for a forgotten sin that swallowed an entire kingdom. Others whispered that it was the cradle of life, a place where gods once walked and left their marks in the sands. Whatever its origin, the desert held its secrets close, offering only fleeting glimpses to those who dared to cross its threshold. The climate was merciless. By day, the heat was so intense it felt like the sun itself was reaching down to burn the skin from your bones. The air was dry, the kind of dryness that stole your breath and left your throat raw with every gasp. At night, the temperature plummeted, the sand turning as cold as ice. The stars above burned bright, too bright, their light sharp and piercing in the inky darkness. The wind howled, carrying with it the eerie sounds of the desert, creaks, groans, and whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Life in the last desert was rare, but it was there for those who knew where to look. Tiny lizards darted across the dunes, their movements quick and skittish, as if they, too, feared the desert's unseen eyes. Plants withered and gnarled clung to life in the most unlikely places, their roots stretching impossibly deep into the sands. There were birds, black and sharp-beaked, that circled high above, their cries echoing like warnings. But there were also creatures that no one could name, things that left tracks too large and too strange to belong to anything ordinary. The locals spoke of these creatures in hushed tones, their voices trembling with a mixture of awe and fear. They told stories of shadows that moved against the wind, of shapes that slithered beneath the surface, leaving ripples in the dunes. These weren't just animals, they were legends made flesh, monsters that defied explanation. And among them, the warworms were the most feared. No one had ever seen one and lived to tell the tale, or so it was said, but their presence was felt in every shifting grain of sand, and every strange vibration beneath the earth. The desert was not uninhabited, though its people were few and scattered. Nomadic tribes wandered the vast expanse, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of the sand. They spoke of the last desert as a place of both beauty and terror, a living thing that could befriend or betray with equal ease. Their stories were woven into the land, each tale a thread in a tapestry of survival and mystery. They carried with them the weight of generations, the knowledge passed down through songs and whispered warnings. One tale told of a caravan swallowed whole by the sand, its members lost without a trace. Another spoke of a wandering hermit who claimed to have seen the whirlworms, their massive forms writhing beneath the surface like serpents of molten gold. He described eyes that burned like fire, mouths filled with teeth as sharp as blades. His words were dismissed as madness, yet his fear was undeniable, etched into every line of his withered face. The desert's lore was as vast as the land itself, filled with contradictions and impossibilities. Some said it was cursed, others that it was blessed. Some claimed it was a gateway to another world, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead grew thin. There were those who believed the last desert was alive, its sands shifting not by chance, but by will. The wind, they said, carried the voices of those who had been claimed by the desert, their pleas for release lost in the endless expanse. There was a story of a lost city buried beneath the dunes, its walls carved with strange symbols and its streets haunted by the echoes of its long-dead inhabitants. The city was said to be the home of the whirlworms, their lair hidden deep within its ruins. The legends claimed that anyone who found it would never return, their bodies consumed and their souls trapped forever in the sands. Yet the lure of the city was strong, and many had sought it, their fates unknown. The last desert was a place of contrasts, where beauty and danger walked hand in hand. The sunrise painted the dunes in hues of gold and crimson, a breathtaking sight that hid the merciless heat to come. The nights, though cold and dark, were filled with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. But for every moment of wonder, there was a shadow, a reminder that the desert was not a place of safety. It was a place of power, of stories that lived and breathed and waited to be told. The wind rose again, carrying with it the faint, mournful sound of something moving far below the surface. The sands shifted, as they always did, hiding and revealing in an endless dance. And somewhere, in the heart of the desert, the whispers grew louder, as if the land itself was alive with secrets too terrible to be spoken aloud. The fire crackled in the quiet of the night, sending sparks spiraling into a sky heavy with stars. Around it, the elders sat, their faces etched with the lines of countless stories. One by one, their voices rose, weaving tales older than memory itself. And always, always, there was the story of the great worm, long, coiled, and terrible, its scales as dark as midnight and its hunger insatiable. Children huddled closer to their parents as the elders spoke, their eyes wide with the terror of the unknown. The air seemed to grow heavier, charged with something ancient and alive, as if the very ground carried the weight of what they spoke. The whirlworm legends were never written in neat lines of text or carved into stone tablets. They lived in whispers, and songs sung to the rhythm of beating drums, and in the warnings passed down from generation to generation. Long before ink-stained parchment, these stories slithered through the hearts of people, binding them together in shared awe and fear. The earliest tales spoke of creatures so vast that their bodies could encircle entire mountains, their movements causing the earth to quake and rivers to change their course. They were more than monsters, they were forces of nature, embodying power beyond human comprehension. But not all stories painted them as mere beasts. In some, they were gods, revered and feared in equal measure. Tribes far from the last desert spoke of a great serpent that swallowed the sun each evening, its endless coils wrapping the world in night. When the sun returned each morning, they said, it was because the worm had chosen to release it, granting light and life another day. The whirlworm was both destroyer and giver, its every action steeped in divine purpose. People offered sacrifices, grain, livestock, even their own blood, to appease the creature, praying for its favor and protection. Across the oceans, and lands untouched by desert sands, echoes of the same creature appeared in other guises. There were the Norse tales of Jormungandr, the great serpent that encircled the world, its very existence a harbinger of doom. In the east, there were dragons, majestic and serpentine, symbols of both chaos and creation. But where dragons flew and commanded the skies, the whirlworm remained bound to the earth, a creature of shadow and soil. It did not breathe fire or soar above the clouds, it waited beneath the surface, unseen and unstoppable. And then there was its transformation. In many cultures, the whirlworm was not born as it was but became so through some act of defiance or desperation. A cursed warrior, doomed to wander the sands in an endless, monstrous form. A village, swallowed whole for their arrogance, its people bound together in a single writhing mass beneath the ground. Transformation was not a gift, it was a punishment, a reminder of humanity's fragility in the face of forces greater than themselves. Even in its symbolism, the worworm was a paradox. It was fear itself, the terror of being consumed by something vast and unstoppable. But it was also change, the shedding of old forms to become something new, however terrible. To some, it represented power, the raw, unyielding strength that comes from embracing one's darkest instincts. To others, it was a warning, a symbol of what happens when ambition and greed go unchecked. In the desert, the worworm's presence was a reminder of mortality. The sand could shift at any moment, the ground giving way to reveal a gaping maw filled with teeth sharper than swords. But to the tribes that called the desert home, it was also a reminder of balance. For every grain of sand that fell into its waiting jaws, another grain rose to form the dunes anew. The worm took, but it also gave, its movements shaping the very land they walked upon. The stories of the worworm were not confined to one place or one time. They spread, carried by traders and travelers who spoke of the great beast in hushed tones over flickering campfires. And with each telling, the creature grew. Its body became longer, its hunger more voracious, its power more absolute. Yet, no matter how many details changed, one thing remained constant: the worworm was not just a creature. It was an idea, a shadow that lingered in the corners of the mind, a fear that could not be named but was always felt. Even now, there are those who claim to have seen it. Tracks too large to belong to any known animal, carved into the shifting sands. Vibrations beneath the earth that could not be explained. Stories of entire caravans disappearing without a trace, their last moments marked by a sound like thunder and the flash of scales beneath the surface. The worworm may have been born in myth, but to those who have felt its presence, it is far more than a story. And so, the fire burned low, the voices of the elders fading into silence. But the fear remained, a heavy, suffocating weight that no one dared to name. Somewhere in the distance, the wind howled, carrying with it a sound that could have been anything or nothing. The sands shifted, their patterns changing in ways that seemed deliberate, as if guided by an unseen hand. And beneath it all, the whispers continued, growing louder, closer, waiting for the moment when they would no longer be ignored. Beneath the fractured moonlight, the desert whispered its ancient secrets. Winds carried grains of sand that had once seen empires rise and fall, scattering them across a barren, endless expanse. Somewhere in the silence, a story stirred, old as the dunes themselves, older than the names whispered by those who dared to speak of the worm lords. Their curse was not one born of fleeting misdeeds, but of a profound arrogance, a defiance that struck at the heart of the divine. The worm lords were not always monsters. Long ago, they were human, kings, priests, and warriors whose ambition knew no bounds. They ruled over the last desert with a grip so tight it seemed even the sand obeyed their will. Their cities glittered beneath the sun, their towers clawing at the heavens as if to challenge the gods themselves. But there was a cost to their pride, a line crossed that could not be undone. The gods, watching from their unseen realms, grew weary of mortals who dared to claim what was not theirs to hold. One story, whispered late at night when even the bravest would shiver, speaks of a king who sought to tame the desert itself. His name was long forgotten, buried beneath the sands, but his tale lingered. They say he commanded his people to build a vast aqueduct, a river carved through the heart of the dunes to quench his city's endless thirst. To ensure its success, he sacrificed 100 lives at the project's inception, their blood staining the ground in a ritual meant to bind the desert to his will. The aqueduct flowed for a time, its waters shimmering like liquid silver in the sun. But one day, without warning, the river dried up. The king's fury was unmatched. He cursed the gods for their betrayal, shouting his defiance into the wind. That night, the ground beneath his palace trembled. He awoke to find his city gone, swallowed by the earth, leaving only silence in its place. And he was not spared. His body twisted, his limbs elongated, his skin turned to scales as black as obsidian. He became the first Worm Lord, condemned to crawl through the sands he had sought to command. Other tales speak of priests who dared to use forbidden rites, summoning powers that were never meant to be harnessed. They sought knowledge, the kind that burned brighter than the desert sun, and for their arrogance, they paid the price. Their bodies were warped beyond recognition, their voices stolen, replaced by an unending hunger that drove them to devour all in their path. The curse of the Worm Lords was not merely one of physical transformation. It was a punishment that cut deeper, severing the very essence of what it meant to be human. Their minds were trapped, aware of the horror they had become, yet powerless to resist their monstrous instincts. They roamed the desert, their massive forms carving pathways through the sand, their cries echoing with a despair that could break even the hardest of hearts. In these stories, the gods are not kind. They are not forgiving. They are relentless forces of balance, ensuring that no mortal oversteps their place in the order of existence. The Worm Lords stand as eternal reminders of this truth, their existence a cautionary tale etched into the fabric of the last desert's lore. The sands themselves seem to carry their pain, shifting and sighing in ways that speak of a restless, haunted land. And yet, there are those who say the Worm Lords were not entirely forgotten. Ancient carvings, hidden deep within the crumbling ruins of the desert, depict figures that resemble both man and beast. In these images, the Worm Lords are not only feared but revered, their monstrous forms surrounded by offerings of food, water, and even human lives. It is as if, over time, they became something more, symbols of transformation, of power gained through suffering. The cities of the last desert, now buried beneath layers of sand, hold echoes of these tales. Archaeologists have uncovered shards of pottery and fragments of murals that hint at rituals meant to honor or appease the Worm Lords. Some show figures with elongated, serpentine features standing beside the gods, as if they had once been divine themselves before their fall. Others depict violent scenes, the Worm Lords devouring their own followers, their hunger insatiable, their curse unending. In every story, the theme remains the same. Hubris. The audacity to challenge forces greater than oneself. Greed. The insatiable desire to claim more than one's share, to bend the world to one's will. And punishment. A sentence carried out not in death but in eternal suffering, a fate worse than oblivion. The desert itself seems to remember. Its silence is heavy, charged with an unseen presence. Travelers have reported hearing whispers carried on the wind, voices that speak in a language no one understands. Some claim to have seen shapes moving beneath the dunes, shadows that ripple and writhe as if something massive stirs just below the surface. And then there are the tracks, huge, serpentine trails that appear overnight, stretching for miles before disappearing without a trace. They say the Worm Lords are still out there, their cursed forms slumbering beneath the sands, waiting for the day when the gods might finally release them, or when mortals once again test the boundaries of their arrogance. Until then, their stories remain, woven into the fabric of the last desert, a reminder that even the greatest among us can fall. Under the silvery veil of starlight, the sands whispered of creatures caught between forms, neither fully human nor entirely beast. The whirlworms, grotesque and haunting, were said to straddle the line between predator and victim, their existence a cruel twist of fate or perhaps a testament to some deeper truth about transformation and survival. The stories told of their shifting forms were enough to haunt the bravest hearts. By day, they could walk among men, cloaked in a guise so perfect it fooled even the keenest of eyes. They spoke, they laughed, they wept, showing the world a reflection of humanity. Yet, when darkness fell, their masks would slip away. Skin hardened into glistening scales, limbs contorted into massive coils, and eyes, once warm, burned with an otherworldly light. Their cries pierced the stillness of the desert night, filled with longing or rage, no one could say. Some claimed they were sentient, prisoners in their monstrous bodies. Stories spoke of whirlworms who spared travelers, who mourned their cursed state in solitude, and who left behind carvings on ancient stones, crude but unmistakably deliberate. These markings, found scattered across the last desert, depicted human-like figures weeping beside serpent forms. The images spoke louder than words, each stroke of the carving tool heavy with pain and regret. Others insisted that they were nothing more than predators, devoid of compassion or thought, existing solely to feed their insatiable hunger. There were tales of caravans that vanished overnight, leaving behind only shredded tents and blood-soaked sand. Survivors, rare as they were, described monstrous shapes with coils as thick as tree trunks and mouths lined with endless rows of teeth. These were not creatures to pity but to fear, an embodiment of nature's raw, unfeeling wrath. The contrast between these two depictions fueled an age-old debate. Were the werewolves creatures of duality, their human hearts locked in a battle against their monstrous instincts? Or had they surrendered entirely, their humanity consumed by the very curse that had transformed them? The answers seemed to shift with every tale. Every whispered account passed from one trembling voice to another. Art from ancient civilizations added layers to their mystery. In one mural, a man knelt beside a towering serpent, his hands raised as if in prayer. In another, a werewolf loomed over a crumbled city, its serpentine body adorned with gold and jewels, suggesting worship or fear, or both. Some carvings showed battles, human warriors standing defiant against the monstrous forms, their weapons raised in defiance of the creature's overwhelming size. Yet, in these depictions, there was always a trace of reverence, a strange recognition that these beasts were more than mere animals. What made these tales so haunting was their ambiguity. Could the werewolves truly shift between man and monster? And if they could, what did that mean for the nature of their curse? Were they damned souls, doomed to repeat their suffering in a cycle of transformation and destruction? Or were they cautionary symbols, a reminder of humanity's capacity for both creation and devastation? One particularly chilling account came from an ancient tablet unearthed near the edge of the desert. It spoke of a village elder who claimed to have encountered a werewolf in its human form. The creature, disguised as a wanderer, approached him at dusk, seeking shelter. The elder allowed him in, offering food and rest. Throughout the evening, the guest said little, his voice soft and his eyes downcast. But as the night deepened, the elder felt an unease he could not explain. He watched as his guest seemed to shift under the flickering light of the fire, his shadow elongating and twisting on the walls. By morning, the guest was gone, leaving behind a trail of deep, circular tracks leading into the dunes. What haunted the elder most was not the transformation he had witnessed, but the guest's final words before retreating into the desert. "I was once a man like you," he had whispered, his voice trembling. "Do not pity me. Fear what I've become." Such stories blurred the line between man and monster, making it impossible to separate one from the other. The werewolves, in their dual forms, embodied the fears and contradictions that lay hidden within the human heart. They were not just creatures of the last desert, they were reflections of the struggles that defined humanity itself, the battle between light and darkness, the pull between compassion and cruelty, the eternal conflict of what it meant to truly be. Even now, as the sands shift and the winds howl through the empty expanse, it is said that the werewolves still walk among us, hiding in plain sight. Their shadows linger in the corners of campfires, their whispers carried on the wind. Those who claim to have seen them speak of a piercing gaze, one that seems to see straight into the soul, as if searching for some unspoken connection or perhaps for absolution they will never find. And somewhere, beneath the desert's endless waves of sand, their monstrous forms lie waiting, restless and eternal. The night in the desert was quiet, but not calm. The silence was heavy, pressing against the ears, broken only by the faint hiss of shifting sand carried on the wind. Under a sky blazing with stars, a caravan moved cautiously, its torches flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. Stories had warned of what lurked beyond the firelight, things that slithered through the dunes, patient and hungry. But warnings had become whispers, and whispers had become myths. And myths, they thought, could not harm the living. Until the screaming began. A sharp, guttural cry tore through the night, silencing even the wind. The travelers froze, their torches trembling in their hands. A man at the rear had disappeared, his belongings scattered across the sand. Before anyone could react, another scream echoed from the opposite end of the caravan. Panic erupted. Some ran, others huddled together, clutching their chests as if the very air was being stolen from their lungs. And then, in the flickering light, they saw it, a massive, writhing shadow against the dunes, too large, too fluid to be real. But it was. This was not a tale for campfires or songs. It was one of countless stories told by those who claimed to have encountered the whirlworms. Each account seemed more chilling than the last, painted with fear and the kind of details that made you glance over your shoulder long after the story had ended. A merchant once spoke of a single glowing eye he saw through the slit of his tent late at night. It did not blink. It did not move. It simply watched. He had no memory of falling asleep, but when he awoke, the sand outside was disturbed in a wide, spiraling pattern, as though something immense had circled his camp. His goods were untouched, but his camels were gone. Their tracks ended abruptly, as if they had been plucked from the ground. Another tale told of a lone wanderer who staggered into an oasis town, his skin blistered from the sun and his voice cracked with desperation. He babbled about an endless chase, a monstrous worm slithering through the dunes, its maw wide enough to swallow the sky. He had survived by throwing his water flask into the sand and running as the beast paused to inspect the sound. Days later, search parties found no trace of the worm, but they did find deep furrows in the sand and the remnants of a shattered water flask. Themes repeated like haunting refrains, mysterious disappearances, impossible sightings, and survivors bearing scars that seemed too deep for the short span of a desert night. The whirlworms, some said, were not merely beasts, but something far worse. They were a force of nature, unstoppable and merciless, indifferent to the lives they consumed. Yet others believed they were creatures of cunning, their attacks deliberate, their terror meant to leave lasting marks not just on bodies, but on minds. But not all who encountered them perished. There were survivors, though they rarely spoke of what they endured. When they did, their voices were often hushed, their eyes darting to shadows that seemed to stretch just a little too long. A shepherd from a remote village spoke of a stormy night when the ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse, as though the earth itself were alive. His flock scattered, bleeding in terror, as a massive shape rose from the sand. He thought it was the end. But as quickly as it appeared, the creature sank back into the ground, leaving behind a strange, undulating rhythm that echoed in his ears long after the night had passed. Some elements appeared in nearly every story. The sand, always restless, always moving, as if hiding secrets just beneath its surface. A chill in the air, even in the blazing heat of day, that made skin prickle and hearts race. And, most haunting of all, the sense that these creatures were watching, always watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Inconsistencies added to the enigma. Some swore the whirlworms were massive, their bodies stretching across the horizon, while others described creatures no larger than a man. Their behavior varied too, sometimes aggressive, other times eerily passive. What remained constant was the fear they left behind, a fear that outlived the stories themselves. Travelers' tales became warnings. Don't walk alone at night. Don't stray from the firelight. Don't make noise that might disturb the sands. These rules were passed down through generations, ingrained in the culture of those who lived at the desert's edge. But even the most careful could not always escape the nightmare. One particularly chilling account spoke of a group of nomads who disappeared without a trace, their camp left undisturbed, their belongings untouched. The only clue was a single spiraling track that led into the dunes and stopped abruptly. Elders whispered that the whirlworms had taken them, though for what purpose, no one dared to guess. What haunted the imagination most was not the violence of these encounters, but their inexplicable nature. Were these creatures guardians of some forgotten treasure, avenging spirits of the desert, or something entirely beyond human understanding? The stories offered no answers, only glimpses into the terror that lingered in the shadows. And still, the sands shift, and the whispers grow. Each grain of sand seems to carry a fragment of a story, a memory of those who vanished, of those who glimpsed something monstrous and lived to tell of it. But as the desert stretches endlessly before those brave or foolish enough to traverse it, one cannot help but wonder, are the whirlworms the watchers of the sands, or the shadows that dwell within them? The shovel struck something solid beneath the sands, sending a sharp vibration through the handle. The treasure hunter froze, the air around him thick with anticipation. His heart pounded in his chest as he knelt to clear the sand away with trembling hands. Each handful revealed more edges of something ancient, something hidden for centuries. But just as the corner of a golden artifact caught the moonlight, the ground trembled. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the shifting of dunes. It was something alive. Legend spoke of great riches buried beneath the desert, treasures so vast that kings would wage wars for mere whispers of their existence. But these riches were never unguarded. The Warworms, they said, were not just creatures of destruction but protectors, eternal sentinels tasked with ensuring that the sand's secrets remained untouchable. To seek such treasures was not just an act of greed but a direct challenge to the ancient guardians. Many had tried. Few had lived to tell the tale. A parchment found in a crumbling monastery recounted the story of an expedition centuries ago. A band of explorers, driven by whispers of a golden city hidden beneath the dunes, had ventured deep into the desert. Days turned to weeks, and the harsh sun bleached their resolve, but they finally uncovered the ruins of an ancient structure buried in the sand. At its center was a colossal stone door marked with carvings of serpentine creatures, their eyes made of polished gems that glinted with a light that seemed almost alive. Ignoring the warnings etched into the stone, they pried the door open. What they found inside remains unknown, for none survived the night. The nomads who discovered the site days later found the ruins collapsed, the sand around it churned as though by an enormous storm. The carvings of the Warworms remained intact, their gem-like eyes gleaming coldly as if in triumph. Modern treasure hunters, armed with technology and skepticism, scoffed at such tales. But even they could not deny the strange coincidences. Devices malfunctioned inexplicably in certain areas. Footprints disappeared without a trace. And always, there were the spiraling patterns in the sand, markings too precise, too deliberate to be the work of wind or weather. Some spoke of finding fragments of treasure, a coin here, a piece of pottery there. But these discoveries were never without cost. One team unearthed a chest filled with what appeared to be jewels, only for a sudden sandstorm to bury them alive moments later. Survivors described hearing a low, resonant hum during the storm, a sound that seemed to come from beneath them, vibrating through the very ground. Archaeologists who studied these artifacts often found themselves drawn into the mystery. A peculiar necklace retrieved from one such site bore the image of a serpent-like creature coiled around a sun. The craftsmanship was unmatched, the details so fine they seemed to breathe. But every researcher who examined it reported unsettling dreams, visions of endless deserts, shifting sands, and shadows moving just beyond sight. The connection between the myths and reality became harder to ignore. Across cultures, similar stories emerged: serpentine guardians, cursed treasures, and the ominous fate awaiting those who dared to trespass. In the last desert, these tales intertwined with the ruins scattered across the dunes, temples, burial sites, and structures whose purpose had long been forgotten. A peculiar find brought the stories to a chilling reality. In a remote corner of the desert, a series of carvings was uncovered, depicting a great battle between humans and creatures of the sand. The humans, armed with spears and shields, were shown falling one by one, swallowed by enormous, coiling figures. At the center of the scene was a depiction of a treasure, a chest overflowing with gold and jewels. Above it, the serpentine guardians loomed, their expressions neither wrathful nor vengeful but patient, as if they knew the sands would always reclaim what was theirs. Treasure hunters often debated whether the Warworms were real or merely symbols. Some argued they represented human greed, a reminder of the dangers of pursuing wealth at any cost. Others believed they were warnings from a time when such creatures roamed the earth, their stories passed down as cautionary tales. Yet, even the skeptics hesitated when faced with the desert's peculiar phenomena. One story stood out, told by a man who had walked the desert for years. He claimed to have found an ancient coin, its surface engraved with strange, swirling patterns. The moment he picked it up, the sand beneath him began to shift. He ran, dropping the coin as he fled, but he could still feel the vibrations in the ground long after he escaped. It wasn't anger, he said, his voice shaking. It was like it was waiting for me to come back. The allure of treasure continued to draw the bold and the desperate into the sands. But as the legends grew, so too did the fear. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of mystery, weaving together the past and the present into a tale that refused to be ignored. The desert, vast and unyielding, became not just a place of hardship but a living entity, its secrets guarded by creatures whose presence could be felt even in their absence. And still, the sands shift, hiding and revealing in equal measure, their movements a silent dance that only the brave, or the foolish, attempt to interpret. The desert never sleeps. At night, when the stars scatter their cold light across the sands, the wind begins its haunting symphony. It slides across the dunes, twisting and curling as if alive, carrying whispers that seem too deliberate to be the work of chance. Travelers often stop in their tracks, heads cocked, eyes wide, certain they've heard their names carried on the breeze. Others swear they hear warnings in a language they cannot understand, yet the fear it sparks is undeniable. In the last desert, these whispers are not dismissed as mere tricks of the wind. They are warnings, ancient and unyielding. Locals call it the voice of the sands, a murmuring tide that rises as dusk falls. To those who listen closely, it speaks of danger, of the silent hunters that burrow beneath the earth, waiting. The warworms, they say, do not strike without the sands announcing their approach. A merchant caravan once reported the sound of 1,000 voices surrounding them in the dead of night. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they felt compelled to turn back. Days later, a second caravan took the same route and vanished without a trace. Their footsteps led to a deep, spiraled hole in the sand, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Some travelers dismiss these tales as products of exhaustion and the cruel desert heat, but even the skeptics falter when the whispers begin. The sound is not like any ordinary wind. It shifts in pitch, rising and falling like breath, carrying tones that prick at the edge of comprehension. Many describe a sense of being watched, as if unseen eyes follow their every move. For centuries, nomadic tribes have passed down stories of the Whispering Sands, often accompanied by chants and songs meant to ward off its warnings. Elders tell of a time when the whispers began as gentle hums but grew louder with the arrival of outsiders. They claim the sands grieve for those who ignore the warnings, and that each whisper is a lament for lives about to be lost. Auditory hallucinations are not uncommon in the harsh emptiness of the desert. The winds play tricks, bouncing sound across vast, barren spaces, creating echoes that seem to emerge from nowhere. But there's something darker about the whispers in the last desert. Scientists who have studied the phenomenon note the peculiar frequencies of the wind in this region, frequencies that resonate deeply in the human ear. Yet no amount of scientific explanation can dispel the feeling that the sands hold secrets older than humanity itself. One story, told in hushed tones by those who have crossed the last desert, speaks of a lone traveler who ignored the whispers. As the sun set and the shadows lengthened, he heard his name spoken softly, as though from just behind his shoulder. He turned, but there was no one there. All night, the whispers followed him, growing louder, becoming a cacophony that drowned out even his own thoughts. By morning, he was gone. Only his camel remained, standing still and silent beside a fresh mound of sand. The symbolic meaning of the Whispering Sands runs deep in the lore of the warworms. Some believe the whispers are the voices of those the creatures have taken, lost souls bound to warn others of their fate. Others see them as the warworms themselves, using the winds to lure prey into their territory. The most unsettling interpretation suggests that the sands are alive, an ancient force that works with the creatures to protect the secrets buried beneath. Ancient carvings in the ruins scattered across the last desert depict scenes of men bowing before the wind, their heads turned as if listening. In some, the figures are shown fleeing, their faces twisted in terror, pursued by spiraled shapes that emerge from the ground. These carvings suggest that the whispers have been a part of the desert story for as long as humans have walked its sands. Even those who have never set foot in the desert find the idea of the Whispering Sands unsettling. It speaks to a primal fear, the fear of being watched, of hearing a voice when you are utterly alone. It is the fear of being warned and knowing you cannot escape what is to come. Yet the whispers are not always warnings. Some believe they offer guidance, helping the lost find their way or steering the desperate toward safety. A wandering scholar once wrote of a strange experience. He became separated from his group during a sandstorm, his compass rendered useless. As the wind howled, he heard a voice, soft, insistent, pulling him in a specific direction. He followed it blindly, stumbling over dunes, until he saw the flicker of firelight and found his companions. When he recounted the event, they claimed they had heard the wind calling his name moments before he appeared. The whispers are as much a mystery as the warworms themselves, intertwined in a dance of fear and fascination. They raise questions that have no answers, leaving only unease in their wake. Those who leave the desert often find the sound haunts them, an echo that lingers in the quiet moments of their lives. For some, it is a comfort, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the secrets it holds. For others, it is a curse, a sound that pulls them back to a place they swore they would never return. The last desert is vast, its sands shifting endlessly under the weight of time. But the whispers persist, a constant thread in the ever-changing landscape. And as the sun sets, casting long shadows over the dunes, the wind begins again, carrying its ancient warnings across the empty expanse. Beneath the scorching desert sun and the infinite sky, there lies a silent terror. Warworms, the shadowy creatures of lore, exist at the razor's edge of nightmare and reality. Those who claim to have seen them often speak in whispers, their voices trembling as they recount the monstrous forms that haunt their memories. It begins with the ground trembling, a subtle vibration that sets the heart racing. Then comes the sight, a dark, coiling mass rising from the sands, immense and unstoppable. Their size alone is enough to paralyze even the bravest of souls. Descriptions vary, but most place them at lengths rivaling ancient trees, their bodies thick and segmented like the rings of an ancient oak. Their surface is described as slick, almost glistening, with a hue that shifts between ashen gray and the burnt gold of desert dunes. It reflects the harsh sunlight in a way that makes it almost seem alive, like the sands themselves have risen to form a predator. The movement is what unsettles most, a fluid, rippling glide that defies logic for something so massive. The head is the stuff of waking nightmares. Eyeless, featureless, and yet alive with a presence that suggests it sees everything. Travelers describe a gaping maw, ringed with rows of teeth that spiral inward, a vortex designed for shredding anything that ventures too close. Some say the teeth glint like shards of obsidian, sharp enough to cleave bone from flesh in a single snap. Others speak of a forked tongue, thick and serpentine, that lashes out with unnatural speed, pulling prey into the cavernous depths. But it is the sound that lingers in the minds of those who encounter these monsters. A low, guttural rumble that vibrates through the bones, growing louder as the creature closes in. It is not a roar or a growl, but something alien, a sound that feels like a warning and a promise all at once. Survivors often claim that the sound remains with them, echoing in their dreams, a reminder of the moment they stood at the edge of something incomprehensible. How could such creatures exist, let alone thrive in the harshness of the desert? Biologists, skeptics, and believers alike have debated their hypothetical anatomy, piecing together fragments of lore and eyewitness accounts. Many point to the segmented body, likening it to that of an earthworm or a snake, designed for burrowing and efficient movement through sand. The skin, though slimy in appearance, is theorized to be tough and resistant, perhaps covered in a mucus-like layer that reduces friction and protects it from the desert's blistering heat. The internal biology of a warworm is a terrifying puzzle. What fuels such a colossal beast in a land so barren? Some speculate that their metabolism is slow, allowing them to sustain themselves on rare but substantial kills. Others suggest they feed on the moisture trapped deep within the earth, their bodies equipped with sensory organs to detect underground water sources. This could explain their habit of surfacing near oases, where human settlements often meet a grim fate. Theories about their hunting methods paint an even grimmer picture. Warworms, it is said, are ambush predators. They sense vibrations in the sand, the subtle movements of footsteps, and wait beneath the surface until their prey is within reach. The strike is sudden, a violent eruption of sand and sinew, leaving no time for escape. It is the kind of predation that leaves behind no trace, no evidence, only silence and empty dunes. Yet, the warworms defy categorization. They seem too large, too perfectly adapted to the desert's desolation, to be mere animals. Many believe they are not creatures of nature, but something else entirely, beings touched by magic or ancient curses. Some legends claim they are the remnants of an old punishment, humans who were transformed for their greed or transgressions. Their monstrous forms are said to reflect their corrupted souls, condemned to roam the sands forever. Others see them as guardians of the desert's oldest secrets, perhaps even treasures long buried beneath the shifting sands. Their existence, in this view, is tied to a purpose beyond survival. They are sentinels, protecting something too valuable or too dangerous for mortal hands to claim. This interpretation carries its own kind of terror, suggesting a consciousness behind their actions, a will that cannot be swayed. But not everyone agrees. Skeptics argue that warworms are nothing more than a collective hallucination, a figment born of isolation and the desert's relentless cruelty. The human mind, when pushed to its limits by heat and thirst, conjures monsters to explain the unexplainable. Yet, even these doubters falter in the face of the evidence, reports from travelers separated by centuries and continents, all eerily consistent in their details. And then there are the scars. Men and women who return from the desert bearing wounds they cannot explain, lacerations too clean, too precise, to be caused by anything natural. Their eyes, haunted and distant, speak of horrors they cannot articulate. These survivors are living proof, or so the believers say, of the warworm's existence. The debate rages on, but the sands offer no answers. They keep their secrets close, shifting and swallowing any proof that might settle the argument. What is certain is this: the warworms, real or imagined, have left an indelible mark on the human psyche. They are a reflection of our deepest fears, the things we cannot see but know are there, waiting just beneath the surface. And as the sun sets and the shadows stretch long across the dunes, the sand seem to breathe, alive with possibilities. The ground feels less stable, the horizon less certain. It is in this silence, this uneasy stillness, that the line between myth and reality begins to blur. And somewhere, beneath the endless expanse of shifting grains, something stirs. The night the sands began to whisper, they spoke of danger. Beneath the moon's cruel gaze, something stirred in the dunes, unseen but present. It wasn't just the tremor in the earth beneath your feet, the sudden, eerie silence before the storm. It was the overwhelming sense of something older than time itself, a force that could shape, bend, and break the world around it. Warworms were more than creatures, they were symbols, embodiments of powers both ancient and terrifying. A desert traveler once described them as beasts from the depths of the earth, and in many ways, that is exactly what they are. Their most feared ability, one spoken of in hushed tones by those who've survived, is their burrowing. With ease and speed that defy logic, they slide beneath the earth, disappearing without a trace. One moment, the sands are calm and endless, the next, the ground heaves and trembles like something alive. What was once solid and certain is now a shifting mass, and from beneath the earth, the warworm rises, ready to strike. The speed with which they can burrow is almost hypnotic. It's not just a matter of survival for them, it's an art, a terrifying skill. And beneath the surface, they thrive. But this is only one of their many powers. There are stories of warworms having venom so potent, so deadly, that a single drop is enough to kill a creature many times their size. Some claim that when the venom is unleashed, it doesn't just kill, it changes. It mutates, turning the world around the victim into something alien, something terrifying. The desert itself seems to darken as the venom spreads, the winds grow colder, and life becomes something to fear. But the venom is not all. Some legends speak of fire. Not just any flame, but a fire that is born of the very creature itself, a fire that burns with a fierceness that seems to be fueled by the deepest parts of the earth. It's a fire that leaves nothing behind but ash and charred remains. This isn't a fire that you can run from, it follows you, creeping and crawling, a flame that rises from the ground and consumes everything in its path. Survivors of such encounters describe the heat as unbearable, the way it sears through skin and bone as if the desert itself was bent on punishing them for stepping too close. But it's not just physical powers that make the whirlworms terrifying. Their true power is more subtle, more insidious. There are those who believe that these creatures possess something far darker than venom or fire, something that taps into the very fabric of reality itself. It's said that the whirlworms can bend time, warp the world around them, and twist fate to their will. A person might wander too close, and in that moment, they are lost, not just in the desert, but in time itself. They become part of a myth, forever trapped in the sands, their bodies turning to dust as they're absorbed into the creature's strange and terrible world. Some stories say that the whirlworms are not merely creatures, they are agents of transformation. A man who encounters one may find himself irrevocably changed, his life twisted by the force of the creature's presence. Perhaps it's a spiritual change, an awakening to powers they never knew existed within themselves. Perhaps it's a darker transformation, a curse that leaves the victim unrecognizable, their soul shattered and fragmented. In some myths, those who survive an encounter with a whirlworm are said to be granted strange abilities of their own. It is as though the creature imparts a part of itself to those it leaves behind, changing them into something else, something powerful, something dangerous. But the transformation is not always for the better. For some, the encounter is a prelude to doom. It's said that the whirlworms are harbingers of the end, agents of destruction and chaos. When they rise from the sands, it is a warning that something terrible is on its way. Perhaps it is the end of a kingdom, a civilization swallowed up by the desert. Or perhaps it is the death of a people, their lives snuffed out like the last embers of a dying fire. In these myths, the whirlworms are not just creatures, they are symbols of fate, of forces beyond human control, forces that sweep across the earth and leave nothing but ruin in their wake. The connection between these creatures and the spirit world is not just folklore, it is a belief that runs deep in the veins of those who live close to the desert. In some cultures, it's said that the whirlworms are the physical manifestations of long-forgotten gods or spirits, beings that once ruled the earth and have since retreated to the shadows. They are both protectors and destroyers, wielding the power to save and to condemn in equal measure. Their presence is both a blessing and a curse, a reminder of the fragile balance between life and death, creation and destruction. And yet, the power of the whirlworms doesn't stop there. There are those who believe that these creatures are not just agents of change, they are creatures of the unknown, of the great mysteries that lie hidden beneath the surface of the world. Some say that the whirlworms are linked to something far older than the desert itself, something that predates time and space, a force so vast and so incomprehensible that it can only be hinted at in myth and legend. Perhaps these creatures are the key to unlocking those mysteries, to understanding the very essence of the earth itself. As the sands shift and the winds howl through the night, it is easy to forget just how little we truly know about the world around us. The desert, with all its beauty and brutality, holds its secrets close, just as the whirlworms hold their power. And perhaps it is better that way, for to understand too much may be to invite a force we are not ready to face. So the desert whispers, and the whirlworms rise from the sands, their terrible powers ever present, waiting for the next story to be written in the shifting, endless dunes. Under the harsh desert sun, the sand is more than just dirt, it's a reminder that everything can be swallowed whole by the earth. Travelers speak of the sudden chill that comes before the storm. The wind carries whispers of something lurking beneath, waiting, watching. For centuries, the people who lived on the edge of the desert have known that there is more to the sands than what the eye can see. The whirlworms, creatures of darkness, were not just a threat, they were an unspoken fear that shaped every aspect of their lives. And so, in every home, in every tent, rituals were performed, small, secret acts designed to ward off the nightmare that crawled beneath their feet. In the dim light of a desert evening, a fire crackles, and the shadows dance around a gathering of elders. The air smells of burning herbs, sweet and sharp, as they chant softly, their voices barely audible above the desert winds. It's not just a tradition. It's survival. Ancient texts tell of rituals that have been passed down through the ages, rituals that, if performed with the right intent and respect, would keep the terrifying creatures at bay. These rites were simple, yet filled with deep meaning: the scattering of salt around the home, the carving of protective symbols into doorframes, the lighting of candles to guide spirits away from the cursed earth beneath. Each act was a thread in the tapestry of life that kept the darkness outside. But it wasn't only the protective symbols that held the creatures at bay. There were offerings, too, small sacrifices made to appease whatever force lay in wait beneath the ground. Goats, chickens, even fruits and grains were left at the edge of the desert, placed on carefully constructed altars. The offerings weren't always made out of fear, they were also made out of reverence. The desert, with all its dangers, was also a source of life. And in return, the people gave back. They believed that by honoring the spirits of the earth, they could maintain a fragile balance, one that allowed them to live and thrive without being swallowed by the endless sands. But not all rituals were so peaceful. In the darkest corners of the desert, where the sun's light never quite reached, there were darker rites, practices designed not just to protect, but to fight back. Shamans, spiritual leaders, and wise elders would call upon ancient powers to protect their people. These were the men and women who could speak to the desert spirits, who could tap into forces far beyond what the ordinary person could comprehend. In a sense, they were the last line of defense against the warworms, guardians who stood between the fragile world of the living and the eternal night lurking just beneath the surface. The rituals these shamans performed were complex, often requiring years of training. There were songs, specific chants that resonated with the earth itself, and gestures that were said to summon the attention of the spirits. Some would create symbols out of fire and sand, believing that fire, bright and hot, could burn away the evil that stirred beneath the earth. Others would carve symbols into their own skin, a permanent reminder of the sacred pact they made with the desert. It was a dangerous practice, for the very act of invoking such power could lead to death if done wrong. But when performed correctly, these rituals could be the difference between life and death, survival and despair. As the years passed, the rituals and charms became a part of everyday life. Parents would teach their children how to perform simple protections, how to lay salt in a circle, how to carve symbols of protection into the doorframe, and how to offer a prayer to the desert spirits. These were not just traditions, they were life or death instructions passed down from one generation to the next, ensuring that the knowledge would never be lost. Even so, the fear never truly faded. No matter how many rituals were performed, the presence of the warworms loomed like a shadow over every desert community. In the dead of night, when the wind howled through the dunes, every person knew that the ground beneath them might give way to something far darker than any of their protective measures could withstand. Some elders told stories of times when the rituals had failed, when even the strongest charms couldn't keep the creatures from rising. These stories were whispered in quiet corners, as if speaking them out loud would bring the creatures into the present, breathing and hungry. But for every story of failure, there were stories of survival, of the rituals working when all seemed lost. In these moments, the power of belief was everything. It was the faith in the symbols, the faith in the power of the desert itself, that kept the creatures at bay. People who lived through such encounters would speak of feeling an unearthly calm, as if the earth itself had decided to spare them, perhaps because they had shown respect, perhaps because they had honored the old ways. Despite the rituals, the fear of the warworms never went away. But that fear became a part of the people's identity, a constant reminder that there was something greater, something more powerful, just beneath the surface. And so, in every town, and every village, the rituals continued. They were not just actions, they were prayers, calls to the spirits, and pleas for protection. Even the most cynical would never dare leave their homes without performing the smallest of gestures, a quick touch to a protective symbol carved into the door, a prayer whispered before stepping outside. The rituals were not just about fighting the warworms. They were about survival. They were about a way of life that existed in the harshest conditions, a life that had learned to coexist with the threat of terror just below the earth's surface. And in that coexistence, there was a strange kind of peace, a peace born from knowing that the fight against the darkness could be won, if only for one more day. Beneath the vast, unyielding desert skies, where the sand seemed eternal and the horizon never-ending, whispers of the warworm lived not only in fear but in faith. It was said that the creatures weren't merely monsters, they were manifestations of something greater, beings that blurred the line between myth and divinity. In the ancient temples, carved from stone that gleamed red under the dying light of the sun, their forms were etched with intricate care. Coiled bodies and gaping maws were not symbols of terror alone, they were also marks of reverence. The priests, their robes woven with the faint shimmer of gold and copper, would kneel before grand statues of the warworms. Offerings of incense and blood, of fruits and rare spices, were laid at their stone feet. The air would fill with the thick scent of myrrh and sandalwood, a haze that blurred the boundaries of reality and spirit. In these moments, worshippers would claim to feel the ground tremble ever so slightly, as if acknowledging their devotion. For the warworm was not only a creature to be feared, but also a being tied to the cycles of life and death, an entity that embodied the harsh balance of existence in the unforgiving desert. In some traditions, the warworm was considered a guardian, a being placed by the gods to protect the treasures hidden deep within the sands. Temples built on the edges of great dunes often depicted the creature coiled around a sacred jewel or ancient scroll, its sharp teeth gleaming in carved stone reliefs. To the faithful, this was not a warning of the creature's ferocity but a testament to its divine role. Only the worthy, the priests would say, may pass the beast. And so, those seeking enlightenment or hidden truths would kneel before its image, their prayers trembling with a mix of hope and terror. Yet, not all depictions were so benevolent. In other shrines, the warworm was shown as an unrelenting force of destruction, its body writhing through crumbling cities and devouring entire civilizations. These images weren't just warnings, they were lessons. The people believed the warworm's wrath came not from malice but from imbalance, an insult to the harmony of the world. These temples stood as reminders that even the smallest act of greed, disrespect, or hubris could awaken the sleeping terror beneath the sands. Priests of these sects would preach humility, urging their followers to live lives of simplicity and respect for the natural order. The rituals in these temples were not performed with gentle reverence but with trembling urgency. Ceremonies would stretch through the night, the rhythmic beating of drums echoing across the dunes like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Worshippers would chant in low, guttural tones, their voices rising and falling like the wind through the desert canyons. Sacrificial fires burned high, their light casting monstrous shadows on the temple walls, shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Some said that during these rites, the warworms themselves could be felt beneath the earth, shifting restlessly, drawn to the sound of their own name spoken in ancient tongues. Despite the fears that surrounded these creatures, there was also a strange kind of admiration. The warworms, with their immense power and eternal presence, were seen as reflections of the desert itself, beautiful, deadly, and enduring. Their images adorned not only temples but also amulets, woven into the very fabric of the people's lives. Farmers carried small carvings of the beast to bless their crops, believing that the creature's connection to the earth would ensure fertile soil. Mothers tied warworm talismans to their children's wrists, praying for protection during the long and treacherous nights. Among the most devout, there were even those who claimed to have seen the warworms during moments of spiritual clarity. They described them not as monsters, but as beings of immense majesty, their scales shimmering like the night sky, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. These visions were considered blessings, rare moments when the divine chose to reveal itself. Those who experienced them often became shamans or spiritual leaders, their lives forever changed by the encounter. But with reverence came fear, and with fear came rituals of appeasement. In some desert communities, the warworms were thought to be gods of transformation, beings that could turn a life of hardship into one of abundance, or vice versa. To offend them was to invite ruin, and so every act of worship was tinged with the desperate hope that the creatures would remain sleeping beneath the sands. During times of drought or famine, when the ground cracked open and the skies refused to rain, the people would gather in the temples, their prayers rising like smoke into the heavens. They would sing songs of forgiveness and humility, offering everything they could spare in the hopes of restoring balance. And yet, there were whispers of another kind of worship, darker, forbidden rites performed in secret. In the dead of night, away from the watchful eyes of the temples, there were those who sought to harness the power of the warworms for themselves. These individuals were said to carve runes into their skin, to drink potions made from the venom of desert serpents, and to call upon the creatures with chants that echoed with the weight of ancient curses. Their rituals were not acts of devotion but of desperation, a dangerous gamble to bend the will of the warworms to their own ends. Most who attempted such rites were never seen again, their fates lost to the shifting sands. And so the warworms lived not only in the ground but in the hearts and minds of those who worshipped them. They were symbols of power and humility, destruction and creation, fear and reverence. Their presence shaped not only the desert but the very souls of the people who called it home. Even now, under the watchful eyes of the stars, their shadows linger, waiting for the sands to stir once more. Under the silken veil of moonlit dunes, where the desert wind carries whispers of ancient truths, a lone voice rises. It is a song, haunting, raw, and filled with a longing so profound that it seems to seep into the sands themselves. The melody drifts over the stillness, telling a story older than memory, a tale of the warworms. With each note, the singer draws the unseen closer, threading together fear, awe, and wonder. These songs, passed from lips now dust to voices still warm, have painted the warworms into the soul of desert life. Around flickering campfires, storytellers sing of their terrifying majesty. Their words, steeped in sorrow and reverence, weave an intricate tapestry of myth. In the verses, the warworms rise from the earth, their massive forms cutting through the dunes like living shadows. Their eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, pierce the hearts of men, leaving them paralyzed between wonder and dread. One such song tells of a boy who wandered too far into the sands. The lyrics speak of the ground trembling beneath his feet and a dark shape emerging, its breath like the furnace of the earth. Just as the creature prepared to strike, the boy sang a song of mourning, not for himself, but for the countless souls lost to the desert. The warworm paused, its massive head tilting as if caught in the spell of the melody. It sank back into the earth, sparing the boy but leaving him forever haunted by the sound of shifting sands. Poetry, too, carries the essence of these myths, etched into the walls of forgotten caves and scrawled on crumbling parchment. One verse, often whispered in hushed tones, describes the warworm as the keeper of buried sorrows, its body coiled around the grief of centuries. Another speaks of the creature as the singer of silence, its every movement echoing the quietude of the desert night, a reminder of the fragility of life under the vast expanse of stars. Artists, driven by a mix of fear and fascination, have captured the warworms in countless forms. In the vivid hues of desert sands and twilight skies, paintings depict their sinuous bodies weaving through the dunes, their scales shimmering like molten gold. One particularly striking image shows a warworm rearing against the backdrop of a blood-red sunset, its eyes blazing like twin suns. The painting seems to pulse with life, as if the creature might crawl off the canvas at any moment. In carved stone and delicate clay, the warworms take on a different kind of life. Amulets shaped like their coiled forms are worn around necks and wrists, not as mere decorations, but as talismans of protection or defiance. These small works of art bear intricate patterns, each line telling a fragment of a story. Some show the warworms entwined with human figures, their forms locked in a delicate balance of power and vulnerability. The art and songs are more than just creative expressions, they are vessels of memory. In a world where the desert constantly reshapes itself, swallowing cities and erasing paths, these stories are anchors. They hold fast to the past, preserving the lessons and warnings carried within the legends of the warworms. Every note sung, every line written, is an act of defiance against time itself. Oral storytelling breathes life into these myths, ensuring that they never fade into silence. Elders, their voices cracked but steady, recount tales of the warworms with a gravity that turns every listener into a believer. They speak of the creatures as though they've seen them with their own eyes, their words painting vivid images that linger long after the story's end. In their telling, the warworms are not just monsters but mirrors, reflecting the fears and hopes of those who live beneath the unrelenting sun. Recurring themes ripple through these stories like echoes. Transformation is a constant motif, the idea that the warworms are not merely beasts but agents of change. They are the guardians of thresholds, the markers of transitions between life and death, safety and danger, ignorance and understanding. The duality of their existence, both revered and feared, resonates in every song and story. Another theme is sacrifice, both literal and metaphorical. Many stories speak of those who gave their lives to appease the warworms, their blood mingling with the sands as an offering. But there is also the sacrifice of ego, of ambition, of the human tendency to conquer and control. In the myths, the warworms remind humanity of its place, not as masters of the earth, but as part of a delicate, sacred balance. And always, there is the motif of the unseen. The warworms are creatures of the hidden, their vast forms concealed beneath the sands until the moment they choose to rise. This idea permeates the art and songs, a reminder that the most powerful forces are often the ones we cannot see. It is this mystery that keeps the stories alive, their allure growing with every generation that adds its voice to the chorus. The wind shifts, carrying the faint echo of a song across the desert. It is a melody both familiar and strange, as if it has always been there, waiting for someone to listen. The notes linger, hovering between the stars and the sand, a promise and a warning wrapped in one. The warworms are silent now, but their stories continue to move, flowing through the hearts of those who dare to hear. The sun hovered over the horizon, its fiery glare scattering shards of light across the endless dunes. A caravan of vehicles rumbled through the sands, their tires sinking momentarily into the golden expanse before surging forward again. In the lead truck, a group of explorers sat in tense silence, their faces a mix of determination and uncertainty. Each bump of the terrain was a reminder that they were treading on forbidden ground, an expanse known only as the Last Desert, where myths were said to slumber beneath the sands. One of the explorers, an older man with withered skin and eyes that seemed to have seen too much, stared out the window. He clutched a faded notebook, its edges frayed, filled with sketches and notes passed down through generations. His grandfather had spoken of this place, of the massive creatures that tunneled through the earth with unearthly grace. As a child, he dismissed the stories as fanciful tales meant to entertain. Yet here he was, decades later, chasing shadows in the desert. The air crackled with a sense of something watching, though no movement disturbed the stillness. The team's equipment, a collection of seismic monitors, drones, and ground-penetrating radar, was state-of-the-art, yet it felt woefully inadequate against the weight of the unknown. They were searching for traces of warworms, those legendary leviathans that blurred the line between myth and reality. And though the science seemed straightforward, there was an unspoken fear that the myths might be more real than anyone dared to admit. In the distance, a drone buzzed like an insect, its camera scanning the landscape for any anomaly. The live feed showed nothing but shifting sand and scattered rocks, but the youngest member of the team, a woman with bright eyes and a relentless curiosity, couldn't shake the feeling that something lay just beyond the reach of the lens. She glanced nervously at the radar monitor, its screen glowing faintly against the harsh light. There was nothing. And yet, the skeptics among them were quick to dismiss the tales of warworms as the product of overactive imaginations. One scientist, a firm believer in empirical evidence, scoffed at the idea of a creature so massive and elusive. If these things existed, we'd have found their bones by now, he argued, his voice cutting through the tense quiet. But even as he spoke, his eyes darted toward the horizon, betraying a flicker of doubt. The desert had a way of making skeptics question their certainty, its vastness filled with too many unanswered questions. The believers, on the other hand, were not so easily swayed. One held up a piece of ancient pottery they had found buried beneath the sand. The design etched into its surface was unmistakable, a spiraling pattern that mirrored the movements described in warworm lore. "This is more than coincidence," she whispered, her voice trembling. This means something." Night fell quickly in the desert, blanketing the world in an oppressive darkness. The team set up camp, their voices hushed as if they feared disturbing the stillness. Around the campfire, they shared theories and debated endlessly. Were the warworms remnants of an ancient species, long hidden from human eyes? Or were they nothing more than a metaphor, a way for early peoples to explain the unexplainable? The older man opened his notebook and began to read aloud. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of countless nights spent wondering about the truth. "They say the ground shakes before they rise," he began, his words drawing everyone's attention. "That the air grows thick and hot, and the sands move as if alive. Some believe they are guardians, protectors of something buried so deep that it has remained untouched for centuries." As he spoke, the youngest member of the group felt a vibration beneath her feet. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill racing down her spine. She looked around, her heart pounding, but no one else seemed to notice. Was it her imagination, or had she felt the earth stir? She remained silent, not wanting to feed into the fears already hanging heavily in the air. The next day, they ventured farther into the desert, their equipment calibrated to detect even the slightest disturbances beneath the surface. The radar began to pick up faint readings, patterns that didn't match any natural formation. It could be a fault line, the skeptical scientist suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. The readings were too regular, too deliberate. It was as if something enormous was moving just out of sight. The tension among the team grew with each passing hour. Arguments flared, tempers frayed, and the lines between belief and disbelief blurred. The desert was testing them, pushing them to their limits. And then, without warning, the ground began to tremble. It was subtle at first, a gentle shaking that could have been a trick of the wind. But it grew stronger, the vibrations resonating through their bodies. Panic set in as the camp descended into chaos. The younger woman scrambled to retrieve the drone, her hands shaking as she tried to steady it. The radar screen lit up with erratic signals, the patterns moving faster and faster. "What is it?" someone shouted, their voice barely audible over the growing roar. No one had an answer. The trembling stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The team stood frozen, their breaths shallow, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of what had caused the disturbance. But there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of sand, stretching out in every direction. The skeptics clung to their explanations: earthquakes, shifting dunes, faulty equipment. The believers, however, knew better. They could feel it in their bones, a truth too vast and too terrifying to put into words. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dunes, the older man closed his notebook and stared into the distance. "It's not about finding them," he murmured, almost to himself. "It's about understanding why they're hidden." The wind picked up, carrying the sound of shifting sand. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it sent a shiver through the group. They packed up their equipment in silence, their minds heavy with the weight of what they had experienced. The desert seemed to watch them as they departed, its secrets intact, its mysteries as vast as the stars overhead. The movie screen flickers, casting a dim light on the faces of the audience, each one glued to the unfolding scene. A vast desert stretches out, the heat of the sun rising in waves over the endless dunes. In the distance, a dark shape emerges from the sand, a massive creature burrowing its way toward the unsuspecting travelers. The camera zooms in on the terrified expressions of the characters, their voices trembling as they whisper the same word in unison: "Warworm." The crowd collectively holds its breath, waiting for the moment to arrive, knowing that the legends of the desert have never been so alive, so real. The warworms, those ancient, terrifying creatures once confined to the realm of myth, are now haunting the silver screen. In the world of entertainment, they have found new life, and with it, a resurgence of interest in the forgotten myths of the desert. As the film's tension builds, the viewer can almost feel the ground shake beneath their feet. The camera zooms out to reveal a sprawling landscape, barren and unforgiving, yet teeming with the unknown. A group of survivors, their faces caked with dust, stumble across the vast expanse, oblivious to the monstrous forces that lurk beneath them. The audience knows that soon, the ancient creatures will rise, and the horrors of old will return to terrorize the modern world. It is a scene that echoes the stories passed down through generations, tales of creatures buried deep within the earth, waiting to break free. But now, these stories have transcended the boundaries of oral tradition, finding their place in the world of popular culture. The influence of the warworm myth is no longer confined to ancient texts or desert whispers. It has burrowed its way into the collective imagination, appearing in literature, movies, and games, where it takes on new forms, new meanings. In the world of literature, the warworms have slithered their way into the pages of novels, their monstrous forms described in chilling detail. Authors, inspired by the myths of the desert, have brought these creatures to life, weaving them into narratives that span genres and styles. They are not merely monsters, they are symbols of something greater, something darker. In these modern tales, the warworms often represent the forces of nature that are beyond human control, the ancient powers that once shaped the earth and now threaten to reclaim it. In one particular book, a lone archaeologist stumbles upon an ancient desert ruin, a place where the warworms are said to sleep. But as the story unfolds, the archaeologist uncovers a terrifying truth. The creatures are not just legends, they are real, and their awakening will bring about the end of the world. The desert, once a place of mystique and allure, becomes a dangerous, unforgiving force, a place where ancient powers lie dormant, waiting to be awakened. The warworms in this tale are not just physical threats, they are the embodiment of a world that has been forgotten, a world that humanity has long since abandoned. In film, the warworms are no longer just shadowy figures lurking beneath the sands. They are fully realized creatures, terrifying in their size and speed, capable of tearing apart anything that crosses their path. Movies like The Sands of Wrath and Burrowed in the Dark have brought the warworms to the screen in ways that were once unimaginable. The special effects are jaw-dropping, creating creatures that seem to defy the laws of nature. But it is not just their physical appearance that captivates the audience, it is the fear they inspire. The warworms are not just monsters, they are forces of nature, reminders of the Earth's raw power and humanity's vulnerability. In these films, the desert is no longer a backdrop, it is a character in itself. It is vast, empty, and full of secrets, secrets that should never be uncovered. The creatures that dwell beneath its surface are not just creatures, they are guardians of the past, protectors of ancient knowledge that humanity was never meant to understand. The warworms are the Earth's response to human curiosity, a warning to those who dare disturb the fragile balance of nature. In video games, the warworms have become formidable enemies, their serpentine forms slithering across desert landscapes, threatening to swallow entire cities whole. Games like Desert's Wrath and Burrowed Below have placed the warworms at the heart of their stories, turning them into interactive experiences where the player must fight to survive against the overwhelming force of the desert's creatures. The player must navigate vast, hostile landscapes, avoid the dangers of the shifting sand, and confront the warworms head-on, all while piecing together the ancient myths that explain their existence. The influence of the warworm myth in these games goes beyond mere monsters to slay. These creatures represent a primal force, a reminder that there are things in the world that cannot be controlled, that will always remain beyond the reach of human understanding. As players face the creatures, they are reminded of the vastness of the world and their own insignificance in the face of nature's power. In this way, the warworm becomes not just a threat to be defeated but a reflection of the deep, mysterious forces that continue to shape the world. But as the warworms have found new life in modern entertainment, they have also undergone a transformation. The myths have evolved, taking on new meanings in the context of today's world. Where once the warworms were viewed solely as destructive forces, they are now sometimes portrayed as protectors, guardians of a world that humanity has lost touch with. In some adaptations, they are the last remaining link to an ancient civilization, the keepers of knowledge that has been forgotten by the modern world. This shift in perspective speaks to a broader trend in popular culture, a growing interest in desert myths and the ancient powers that once ruled the earth. The desert, once seen as a barren, empty wasteland, is now viewed as a place of mystery and magic, a place where the past lingers just below the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The warworms, once feared and misunderstood, are now embraced as symbols of the Earth's untamed power, reminders that there is more to the world than meets the eye. As the stories of the warworms continue to evolve, so too does their role in modern culture. They are no longer just creatures of fear, they are creatures of wonder, awe, and reverence. And in the shifting sands of time, they will continue to slither, burrow, and haunt the edges of our imagination, reminding us that some myths are never truly forgotten. The desert stretched endlessly under a blood-orange sky, its shifting sands whispering ancient secrets with every gust of wind. In the stillness, something moved, a faint tremor beneath the surface, subtle but undeniable. The ground bulged, then flattened again, as though the earth itself breathed. It was the kind of moment that could be dismissed as a trick of the mind, a mirage born from the scorching heat. Yet, for those who watched closely, it was enough to ignite an unsettling question: what if the warworms were more than mere legend? For centuries, these stories have been dismissed as the fabric of imagination, stitched together by fear and wonder. But every myth has a root, and some roots run deeper than others. Cryptozoologists, those brave explorers of the unknown, have dared to look at these tales not as fiction but as possible fragments of a hidden truth. Could the desert, with its vast, untamed expanse, truly hide creatures so massive and elusive that they have evaded detection for generations? The possibility is as thrilling as it is terrifying. Warworms, if they exist, would defy everything we know about life on Earth. Their colossal size, their ability to burrow unseen through the sand, their seemingly predatory nature, all of it challenges the limits of biology and physics. Yet, as skeptics scoff, there are whispers from the fringes of science that offer tantalizing hints of plausibility. Geologists have long marveled at strange patterns in the sand, vast rippling formations that seem to suggest movement beneath the surface. Could these be the trails of ancient burrowing creatures? Some have speculated that such organisms, if real, might rely on a unique adaptation, skin that secretes a mucus-like substance to lubricate their passage through the harsh, shifting grains. This theory, while speculative, has roots in observable biology. Smaller burrowing creatures, like earthworms and mole crickets, exhibit similar behaviors, albeit on a much smaller scale. The skeptics, however, demand hard evidence. They argue that such creatures, if they were as large as the legends suggest, would leave undeniable traces, massive bones, fossilized remains, or at least significant disturbances in the geological record. But the desert is a place of erasure. Winds scour its surface clean, burying and revealing secrets with a randomness that defies human understanding. What if the remains of these creatures lie hidden, deep beneath the shifting dunes, waiting for time or chance to uncover them? Biologists weigh in with theories both fascinating and unsettling. The desert, they say, is a paradox, both harsh and generous. It offers little in the way of water or shelter, yet its ecosystem is teeming with life uniquely adapted to survive. If warworms existed, they would need to thrive in an environment that seems hostile to large creatures. Could they have evolved to feed on the microscopic organisms that dwell within the sand itself, or perhaps on the occasional carcass of animals that succumb to the desert's unforgiving heat? Then there is the matter of their size. To sustain something so massive, there would have to be an energy source substantial enough to support their existence. Some theorize that warworms, like deep-sea creatures, might draw energy from geothermal vents or underground water sources. This connection to subterranean life raises another chilling possibility. What if these creatures are not confined to the desert at all, but move through networks of underground tunnels that stretch far beyond what we can see? Such ideas are thrilling, but they also invite fear. Imagine the enormity of a creature that could create such tunnels, its body twisting and writhing beneath the earth, unseen yet ever present. Imagine walking across the desert, unaware that just a few feet below, a beast slumbers, its massive coils nestled in the cool embrace of the sand. The debate between believers and skeptics rages on, each side armed with their arguments, their evidence, or lack thereof. Scientists have turned to technology to settle the matter, deploying tools that seem almost as fantastical as the creatures themselves. Ground-penetrating radar scans the Earth, sending pulses deep below the surface in search of anomalies. Drones equipped with thermal imaging sweep across the dunes, their cameras capturing ghostly images of heat patterns that might hint at something alive beneath the sand. And then there are the recordings. Over the years, cryptozoologists have collected a series of audio anomalies, low-frequency rumbles that seem to emanate from deep within the Earth. These sounds, dubbed the desert's heartbeat, have baffled researchers. Some claim they are the calls of the warworms, a haunting echo of their existence. Others insist they are natural phenomena, the result of shifting sands or tectonic activity. But to those who believe, the sounds are undeniable proof that something ancient and alive dwells beneath the desert's surface. Even among those who dismiss the warworms as myth, there is an unspoken respect for the stories. The legends, they admit, are persistent, passed down through countless generations. Could it be that these tales hold a kernel of truth, distorted over time but rooted in real encounters with creatures long since vanished, or perhaps still lurking, unseen? The thought lingers like a shadow on the edge of the mind, impossible to shake. For every scientific study that dismisses the possibility, there is a whispered account of a strange sighting, a fleeting glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. A herder claims to have seen a massive shape moving beneath the sand, its undulating form disappearing as quickly as it appeared. A lone traveler recounts a night spent on the dunes, waking to find the earth beneath him trembling, as though something enormous stirred below. And what of the environmental factors that might allow such creatures to thrive? The desert is a place of extremes, its surface scorching by day and freezing by night. Yet, beneath the sands, the temperature stabilizes, creating an environment that, while challenging, is not entirely inhospitable. The sands themselves, rich with minerals and microorganisms, could provide sustenance for creatures adapted to extract nutrients in ways we can barely comprehend. As the arguments swirl, one thing becomes clear: the warworms, whether real or imagined, have captured something fundamental about the human experience. They represent the unknown, the uncharted, the terrifyingly vast and incomprehensible forces of nature. To believe in them is to acknowledge that there are still mysteries in this world, still corners of the earth that defy understanding. The sun sinks low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. The air cools, and the wind picks up, carrying with it the faintest of whispers. Somewhere, far beneath the sands, the earth shifts. It might be nothing. Or it might be something ancient stirring once more. The sands hold their secrets tightly, and for now, they remain silent. But the question lingers, as vast and endless as the desert itself: what if? The sandstorm howled like a living beast, a relentless, chaotic force that swallowed the world in a veil of blinding grit. Through its suffocating embrace, something unseen moved, vast and terrifying, a shadow stretching across the fabric of existence itself. It wasn't just the fear of the creature that gripped the heart, but the fear of what it represented, a darkness too immense, too incomprehensible to confront. The warworm was more than a monster, it was a reflection, a reminder of what humanity tries so desperately to bury beneath the surface. The desert, an unforgiving expanse of emptiness, has always mirrored the inner landscapes of the human soul. It strips everything bare, leaving only what truly matters, or what we most fear. In the myths of warworms, this fear becomes flesh, coiling and twisting in the sands, a physical embodiment of the unknown. For what is more terrifying than not knowing? The tremor beneath your feet could be nothing more than shifting dunes, or the approach of something that should not exist. Warworms slither through the cracks of human understanding, embodying fears that have haunted us for centuries. They are isolation given form, a reminder that in the vastness of existence, we are but specks of dust, vulnerable and exposed. They represent survival in its rawest, most brutal state, where each moment is a battle and each decision a matter of life or death. And they whisper of mortality, that inevitable truth we all try to ignore until the sands begin to shift beneath our own feet. In literature, the warworm is not just a beast, it's a metaphor. Its burrowing, its unseen presence beneath the surface, echoes the fears we bury within ourselves. The stories that spring from these myths often aren't about the creature itself, but about the human struggle to face what lies beneath. A hero braving the desert isn't just battling a monster, they're battling their own shadows, their own doubts and regrets. The warworm becomes a mirror, forcing them, and us, to confront the things we would rather leave hidden. The desert winds sweep away the surface, exposing layers of meaning buried in these tales. The warworm's hunger is more than just a biological need, it's the hunger of fear itself, devouring everything in its path. Its massive, coiling form becomes a symbol of the weight of the unknown, pressing down on our chests, making it hard to breathe. And its movements beneath the sand remind us of those silent, unseen forces that shape our lives, forces we cannot control or even fully understand. In psychology, the warworm is an allegory for the subconscious, that hidden realm where our deepest fears and desires dwell. Just as the creature moves unseen beneath the sand, so too do our thoughts and emotions churn beneath the surface of our awareness. The warworm's sudden, violent emergence mirrors the way these buried feelings can erupt without warning, overwhelming us with their intensity. It's a reminder that the monsters we fear most are often the ones we carry within ourselves. Yet, there's something more to these stories, something that lingers like the scent of rain on dry earth, promising both renewal and destruction. The warworm is not just a symbol of fear, it's a symbol of survival. Its ability to endure the harshest conditions, to thrive in a world where so little can survive, speaks to the resilience of life itself. It's a paradox, a creature that embodies both the terror of the unknown and the strength to face it. This duality is what makes the warworm such a powerful metaphor. It reminds us that fear and courage are two sides of the same coin. To stand in the desert, to feel the shifting sands beneath your feet and the weight of the infinite sky above, is to confront the essence of existence. It's a moment of profound vulnerability but also of profound strength, a reminder that even in the face of the vast and the unknown, we can endure. As the stories of warworms echo through the sands of time, they take on new shapes, reflecting the changing fears and hopes of the societies that tell them. In some versions, the creature is a destroyer, a force of nature that cannot be reasoned with or defeated. In others, it becomes a guardian, a protector of the desert's secrets, a reminder that not all mysteries are meant to be solved. In modern retellings, the warworm often serves as a stand-in for the challenges of our own time. Its presence in the desert becomes a metaphor for climate change, for the ways we have disrupted the natural world and the dangers that lie ahead if we continue down this path. Its elusiveness mirrors the uncertainty of the future, the sense that we are standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. And yet, the stories persist. They are retold and reimagined, each generation finding new meaning in the ancient myths. The warworm becomes a symbol of humanity's enduring fascination with the unknown, a reminder that even as we push the boundaries of knowledge, there will always be mysteries that elude us. The sands shift once more, the desert surface rippling like the surface of a vast, endless sea. Somewhere beneath, a shadow moves, slow and deliberate, as though aware of the eyes watching from above. The warworm is a legend, a metaphor, an allegory, but it is also something more. It is the fear that binds us, the courage that drives us, the questions that keep us searching. And as the sun dips below the horizon, casting the desert in a cloak of shadow and fire, it is the promise of what lies beyond, waiting to be unearthed. The horizon shimmered with a mirage that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of comprehension. The last desert stood there, vast and silent, its sands carrying whispers from a world that felt neither fully real nor entirely imagined. It wasn't just a place, it was something more, a threshold where reality blurred and something ancient stirred, just out of sight. There is something unnervingly beautiful about a space that refuses to belong to one world or another. The last desert was such a place, its very existence a question mark. It felt like standing on the edge of a dream that could collapse into nothingness or transform into something that defied understanding. People who had walked its shifting sands often described an unease that went beyond fear, a sense that they were trespassing in a space that didn't want to be known. For centuries, myths had flowed like rivers into the sands of the last desert, as though it drank them and held them suspended in time. Stories of impossible creatures, of voices that spoke from nowhere, of visions that changed lives. These weren't just tales, they were the threads of a tapestry woven from both human imagination and something primal. The desert, with its endless dunes and deceptive calm, seemed to pulse with a life that didn't need the approval of reason. Walking through such a place was like stepping between two worlds. One foot rested in the safety of reality, with its rules and boundaries, while the other hovered in the unknown, where rules didn't apply and anything felt possible. It was a liminal space, suspended between the seen and the unseen, where truths were mutable and the line between fact and fiction grew thin as desert air. There was no escaping the pull of its paradox, a place so vast and empty, yet filled with the weight of infinite stories. To some, the last desert was a challenge to the modern mind, a reminder that not everything could be measured, catalogued, or proven. In an age where satellites could map every corner of the planet, this place stubbornly resisted definition. Its myths persisted not because they couldn't be explained, but because they didn't want to be. They thrived in the cracks of human certainty, slipping through the fingers of logic and nesting in the shadows of doubt. The last desert demanded something from those who ventured into it. It asked them to suspend their disbelief, to let go of the need for answers, and to embrace the possibility of living myths. In its silence, there was a hum, a vibration that seemed to speak directly to the soul. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something else, a reminder of what it meant to feel small and infinite all at once. Philosophers had long been fascinated by such spaces. They called them thresholds, places where human understanding faltered and something greater peeked through the cracks. The last desert wasn't just a landscape, it was an idea, a concept that invited reflection on what it meant to exist. To walk its sands was to confront the fragility of human perception, to accept that not everything needed to be resolved or even understood. And yet, it wasn't just an abstract experience. For those who dared to wander its endless expanse, the desert was deeply personal. It had a way of holding up a mirror, reflecting not what the traveler wanted to see, but what they needed to. The stories of those who returned were filled with moments that felt too strange to dismiss, too real to forget. A man might swear he saw a shadow moving across the moonlit dunes, only to realize it mirrored the grief he'd buried long ago. A woman might hear her name whispered by the wind, carrying a truth she'd avoided her whole life. In this way, the myths of the last desert weren't just about what was out there, they were about what was within. They revealed the human hunger for meaning, the longing to connect with something larger than oneself. At the same time, they whispered a caution: the unknown wasn't always kind. It could be beautiful, yes, but it could also be terrifying, a reminder that life's greatest mysteries didn't owe us comfort. Even so, people continued to be drawn to the last desert, unable to resist its call. Artists painted it, their brushes capturing something more than just the play of light and shadow on sand. Writers wove its essence into their stories, their words trembling with the weight of what they couldn't quite name. Musicians found themselves composing melodies that felt as though they had been carried on the wind from the heart of the dunes. The allure of the unknown was a thread that ran through all these creations. It was as though the desert itself had a voice, one that spoke to the deepest parts of those who dared to listen. And in that voice was a truth both unsettling and comforting, that the world was still vast, still full of wonder and terror, still capable of leaving us breathless. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sands in hues of gold and crimson, a sense of stillness settled over the last desert. It was the kind of stillness that came not from absence, but from presence. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something unseen to awaken. And those who stood on its edge couldn't help but feel that they, too, were part of the story, not just observers, but participants in a tale that had no end. Somewhere in the distance, a single gust of wind lifted the sand, spiraling it into the twilight. It moved with a grace that seemed almost deliberate, as if it carried a message from the heart of the desert itself. What it said would depend on who was listening, but its meaning lingered, hanging in the air like a promise or a warning. The last desert didn't just exist, it endured, a space where the known and the unknown collided, leaving behind something more. The wind howled through the dunes, carrying with it a voice older than memory. It whispered truths into the ears of those brave enough to listen, truths about the balance between fear and awe, power and humility. The sands had seen everything, the rise and fall of empires, the struggles of those who sought to conquer the desert, and the quiet surrender of those who understood its lessons. Among these whispers lay the legends of the whirlworms, creatures that seemed to belong more to nightmare than reality. Yet their stories weren't just about monstrous forms lurking beneath the surface. They carried warnings, painted in the stark simplicity of sand and shadow, about the dangers of arrogance and the fragility of human existence. For in the presence of something as untamed as the desert, humanity's sense of control was always an illusion. Warworm myths spoke of creatures that thrived where others could not, burrowing deep into the heart of the land. Their resilience was a testament to nature's raw power, a force that could not be subdued or tamed. These tales reminded people of their place, not as masters of the earth, but as inhabitants who owed their survival to respect and coexistence. The warworms, in their terrifying glory, were a mirror reflecting the consequences of forgetting this truth. The moral weight of these stories grew heavier with each retelling. There was the tale of the caravan that ignored the signs, plowing through the sands with an arrogance born of desperation. They believed their modern tools would protect them, but the warworm came not for those who listened, only for those who defied the unspoken laws of the desert. The sand swallowed them whole, a haunting reminder that technology could never replace wisdom. And then there were quieter stories, ones that whispered rather than roared. A wandering hermit, they said, once shared his water with the parched earth, offering respect to the unknown. The warworm passed him by, its shadow slipping across the dunes without a sound. In his humility, the man had survived, not through strength, but through reverence. These stories lived on as quiet prayers, teaching that survival was not just about endurance, but understanding. In modern life, where skyscrapers pierced the clouds and technology reigned supreme, these lessons seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Yet, beneath the hum of machinery and the glow of screens, the old truths still stirred. Humanity had traded the unknown for the illusion of mastery, forgetting the power that lay in what could not be controlled. The warworm legends whispered of consequences, not punishments, but the inevitable results of forgetting one's place in the natural order. These ancient stories also touched something deeper, something less tangible. They spoke of the human spirit's enduring connection to the supernatural, to forces that refused to be boxed into the neat confines of logic. They reminded people of their yearning to believe in something greater than themselves, even if that something was terrifying. The warworms, in their monstrous mystery, called out to the primal parts of the soul that still longed for wonder. Beyond fear, the legends carried a sense of balance, a reminder that even the fiercest storms eventually pass, leaving behind a stillness that demanded reflection. The sands, with their endless shifts and swirls, were both destroyers and preservers. They erased footprints but cradled bones, burying the past while keeping it safe. This duality resonated with those who heard the tales, reminding them of life's fleeting nature and the importance of treading lightly. Warworms became symbols of the choices humanity faced. Their burrowing, relentless and unseen, mirrored the hidden forces within people, the fears, desires, and instincts that shaped their actions. To confront a warworm was to confront oneself, to face the darkness that lived not in the sands, but in the soul. And just as the desert demanded respect, so too did these inner forces, requiring acknowledgement and balance. The myths also begged a question: how did humanity's relationship with the natural world shape its relationship with the supernatural? The warworms, born of the earth yet belonging to something otherworldly, stood at the crossroads of these realms. They were a reminder that nature and the supernatural were not separate but intertwined, each feeding into the other. To harm one was to disrupt the balance of both. The desert, with its vast emptiness, was a stage upon which these lessons played out. It was a place where the boundaries between life and death, human and inhuman, blurred. In the shifting sands, people found echoes of their own struggles, the fight for survival, the longing for meaning, and the need to confront their fears. The warworm legends were not just tales of monstrous beasts, they were stories of the human condition, stripped bare and laid raw beneath the desert sun. As the last light of day faded into the cool embrace of night, the desert seemed to exhale, its breath carrying the weight of countless stories. Somewhere, out in the vastness, the warworms moved unseen, their presence felt but never fully known. They were guardians of the lessons etched into the sand, lessons that refused to be forgotten. And as the stars began to pierce the velvet sky, the whispers rose again, pulling those who listened closer to the edge of understanding. The wind stirred the dunes, carrying a sound so soft it could have been mistaken for silence. But if you listened closely, there was something there, a low hum, like the earth itself whispering secrets only the patient could hear. It was the sound of the sands, always shifting, always speaking, telling stories older than memory. And in those whispers, the whirlworms lived on, not just as creatures of fear, but as echoes of everything humanity cannot fully grasp. Legends like these were never meant to be contained in books or confined to the minds of storytellers. They were alive, carried forward by those who dared to listen, evolving with each retelling. The whirlworms were more than myths. They were symbols, reflections of the fears, hopes, and questions that people have carried across generations. The desert, vast and unyielding, had become their home not just because it was barren, but because it was timeless, an unchanging stage for humanity's unending search for meaning. In the cold light of day, the stories might seem small, dwarfed by the scale of modern life. Yet, beneath the hum of technology and the glow of artificial lights, the sand still whispered. The myths lingered, stubborn and unyielding, because they spoke to something timeless. They reminded people that the world was full of things they might never fully understand, and that perhaps it was better that way. There was a beauty in not knowing, in the gaps where certainty ended and imagination began. Whirlworms, with their shadowy forms and fearsome power, became the embodiment of those gaps. They weren't just monsters hiding in the sand, they were questions buried deep within the human soul. What do we fear most? What lies beneath the surface of what we think we know? And how do we find courage when faced with the unknown? These questions didn't have answers, not really. But that was the point. The myths endured not because they solved life's mysteries, but because they embraced them. In a world that often demanded certainty, the stories of the whirlworms offered a different kind of truth, one that thrived in ambiguity and thrummed with the raw energy of possibility. The sands of the last desert were more than just a setting. They were a symbol, a living metaphor for the human experience. Endless, shifting, and unpredictable, they reflected the fragility of life and the inevitability of change. To walk among them was to confront one's own vulnerability, to feel the weight of existence pressing down with every step. And yet, in that vast emptiness, there was also freedom, the chance to imagine, to question, to wonder. The stories told around campfires, beneath star-filled skies, weren't just for entertainment. They were acts of preservation, ways to hold onto the intangible parts of humanity that couldn't be measured or cataloged. Myths shaped people as much as people shaped myths, creating a shared language that connected the past to the present. In every tale of the whirlworms, there was a piece of everyone who had ever listened, a thread that tied their fears and dreams to those of generations before. Even now, when much of the world had been mapped and explained, the allure of the unknown hadn't faded. It lived in the quiet moments, in the spaces where science and reason paused, and something older took over. The whirlworms were a reminder that not everything needed to be understood to be meaningful. Some things were meant to be felt, to linger like a half-forgotten melody that refused to fade. The sands whispered on, weaving tales of creatures that defied logic, of places where myth and reality blurred. These stories weren't about proving what was real or uncovering hidden truths, they were about keeping the spirit of wonder alive. They invited people to step into the unknown, not with the intent of conquering it, but with the humility to simply stand in its presence. Somewhere, out in the endless expanse, the wind carried the faintest trace of a memory. It wasn't a sound or a voice, but a feeling, a pull toward something ancient and enduring. The desert stretched on, vast and silent, its secrets guarded by time and the shifting sands. And yet, the whispers remained, calling out to those willing to stop, to listen, and to wonder what might still be hidden just beneath the surface.